Thanks, Scott. And welcome everybody today. I'm glad that you decided to spend an hour of your afternoon here. Um, as I've been thinking this week, I've had a couple of trainings over the last couple weeks. I've also um, had some shifts in my experience with the whole quarantine thing, and I was hoping to skate through this relatively emotionally unscathed and relationally unscathed, but I don't think that's in the cards for any of us. And so the topic I want to talk about today is distressing events in relationships and the impact that those have. And not just the distressing events that we're living through, but also the compounded effect of unattended to distressing events. I would say with everybody that I'm working with right now, and in my own life included, what I've seen this worldwide COVID event do is it's a magnifier for relationship dynamics. If you have some positivity and some support and some safety, I think you're really feeling that and enjoying that in the relationships you have it in. If there is strife and there's disconnect and there's resentment, I think you're definitely feeling that in your relationships too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research out of the Gottman Institute on distressing events and how those impact relationships. So these can be things like violence, drugs, kind of the big life events. You know, we pack up the car and go to treatment over this. It can also be things like this relationship is turning into something that I didn't bargain for. I didn't think this is what it was going to be like. Um, or something that your partner does that's repulsive to you. The key word there is repulsive, not annoying. We all have that, but repulsive. And again, at the outset of a lot of relationships, I think even when it comes to things like violence and drugs, it can be our tendency to say, this is small in comparison, or it's not as bad as it could be. So I'm going to stick it out with this person. And over time, what tends to happen, because these big distressing things are hard to start talking about and hard to start addressing, what happens over time is our own resentment and the unhealthy patterns in the relationship, they cement themselves and they deepen around this. So when it comes time to being at the end of your rope, or there's an opportunity for repair in the relationship, like the crisis of discovery around addiction, a lot of times we can still do that very human thing of I don't want to take on more problems than I think I can handle. So let's just stay focused on what's going on right now. But these bigger things that have been playing in the background for a while, they really do need to be addressed at some point. And I would say this like with all the things we talk about, this extends beyond romantic or domestic relationships and into work relationships too. For me, the takeaway lesson of this is that all things are relevant at all times. And unless there's really been careful work through and repair and accurate assessment and diagnosis of what the problem is, the effects of that problem are likely going to continue to reverberate through the relationship. I just want to say a word about those distressing events, like this is turning into a relationship that I didn't bargain for, and something my partner does is repulsive to me. To me, the courtship and getting to know you phase never ever stops. So just yesterday, I took a call from another clinic in the county that I work in, and they're interviewing one of my former coworkers, and he listed me as a reference. And they were asking what my experience was like working with him, pretty standard stuff. And I asked them, what was your impression of him in the interview? And they said, we're blown away. He's really impressive. And I said, I agree. I think I felt lucky to work with him, and I think you would be well served by working with him too. Now, I hung up the phone and I reflected. I had about a 4-year working relationship with this man, and it wasn't all roses, and it wasn't all like, oh my gosh, it's so great to work with you. It wasn't full of strife. But I reflected afterward, was that an accurate review of this guy? And I said in the beginning, yes. I said to myself in the beginning, yes, that was an accurate view of this guy. But over time, we continue to discover and we continue to see not just who our partner is, but how that impacts us. So there is always room, I think, for distress to build around who we're in a relationship with and what the relationship feels like. sometimes things like PTSD, depression, and other underlying individual issues are part of what causes the distress. Like, think about something that might be repulsive to you in a relationship. It might not be that you are just with or employed by or working next to the most despicable person in the world, and they're that way intentionally. There may be some issues that get in the way of them being completely pro-social and pro-interdependence. And so this is where, in any relationship equation, I think individual work is an indispensable piece of the equation. And a lot of times couples that I work with and individuals I work with will misinterpret that as, oh, so you're saying the problems in this relationship rely on one side or the other. And once this gets fixed, then we're fixed. And that's not the truth at all. In fact, I think relationships work best, and this is something that Stan Tatkin talks about, is when both people are committed to working on the relationship, not each other. They work on themselves and they work on their relationship, not each other. That's where you have a fertile enough field to really start working on some bonding. And sometimes it can take some work to shift there. Some of the most vulnerable things I've ever seen people in relationships do are to admit when something's not working well for them. In the past, I worked with a couple where he had many traits of what we used to call like autism spectrum disorder. He didn't quite, the social and emotional reciprocation didn't quite click for him. And it, of course, was a really big source of pain for his spouse. It was an even bigger source of pain for him. And he said something to me like once, I know that when we're in an interaction, I'm missing things. I just don't know what I'm missing, and I don't know what to look for. And I think a lot of times when we might have something like PTSD or mood disorders going on, what might get projected is, how dare you say that I have a problem? But really what we might be experiencing individually is, I know something's not working. And it's really scary for me to admit that because I don't know where to start. So it's an act of courage, and I think it's an act of love and support for any relationship to turn into yourself and to start looking at what's going on with me and how might that impact how I relate to other people. Again, not saying I'm the source of all the problems, but recognizing that you're part of the recipe. You help make the relationship soup. I go back to, I forget, I know the book that I read this in, but I forget the author's name, but his big thing, it was a parenting book. His big thing was people do better if they can. And recognizing that with ourselves too. If we can do better, we usually do our best. And when we're falling short there, it's usually because there's some kind of skill we might lack, some kind of insight we don't have. Something we need that we don't already have. And that's where individual work, I think, really helps with some of these distressing events. Now, I said a little bit earlier that our initial responses to these distressing events can turn into some pretty unhealthy patterns. I know very few couples that I've started work with that they had a culture of transparency, honesty, and care with each other around difficult issues from the beginning. That's one of the reasons why they end up in my office, is because they're not sure how to talk about it. Or in a workplace, I think most folks are more concerned with keeping their job and keeping the distress to a minimum than they are correcting cultural problems in the workplace. Yet things have a way of coming to a head. And one of the things that we have to look at is not just how did this problem get started, which is really important to address and to get to. And this is where, like in addiction recovery for couples, this is where I think things like disclosure and individual recovery and establishing sobriety, and for partners establishing safety, that's where I think all of that is critical. There's also these habitual negative ways of interacting that we've developed over time that also need to be addressed. And it's not, I find it rarely the case that just addressing the root cause changes that kind of interaction. We literally have to learn new ways of interacting and recognize that those ways of interacting that didn't work may have grown out of these distressing events that we didn't know how to talk about, or that we were, in self-preservation mode rather than work on the relationship mode around. So some of those unhealthy patterns, we might be explosive in our anger with each other. We might use withdrawal rather than having difficult conversations. There may be less trust and less intimacy, both emotional and sexual, as a way of dealing with these. And I would say in any functional relationship, even in the workplace, we have to get down to the nitty gritty of how intimate is this relationship, and what pathways does that intimacy need to flow along freely in order for this relationship to work. So oftentimes I'll see with couples, after we identify the genesis of those distressing events, we still have a lot of work to do to change some of those relational patterns. And it helps to have the context of knowing where this came from and why we started doing this. It can help us stay focused on what it is that we want to change and why it is we want to change it. So in summary on that, we have to treat the processes that are affected by the distressing events, not just the core issue. So I'm looking at this with my kids. I mentioned at the beginning, there's an emotional reckoning happening at my house right now with this COVID quarantine. And I'm looking at my two boys, 10 and 7, who are increasingly angry and sad because they don't get to see the people who are most important in the world to them, like grandparents, cousins, friends. They don't have access to that. Now, just before we got on and started recording, Scott was asking me about restrictions being lifted in Utah, where I'm from, and they are. However, I noticed a couple nights ago we had two of my oldest friends over, and we enforced social distancing, but we played like cornhole, and they watched a movie together outside and had pizza, and we maintained all of that. And there was a part of me that was really, really hoping that this cloud that has been hanging over him and his anger would just dissipate, because he got to spend face-to-face time with his friends, and he woke up the next morning just as surly as ever and just as angry as ever. Just because the root cause is being addressed doesn't mean we don't have a backlog of things that we need to address. There's grief for him, there's grief for me. And it's important to keep that in mind. Just because we might be in a better place, like with sobriety or maybe even some couples help and stabilization, that doesn't mean that the way we interact has fundamentally changed, or that our grief has been complete. So this is the role that I think distressing events play for couples, is not just a source of distress and heartache, but also as a calibrating point, remembering where we came from and what it did to us or what it changed for us. That helps us to stay out of the fantasy that a good relationship is one where it's smooth sailing all the time, or we feel positive most of the time towards each other. And a good relationship is really one where we're committed enough to our own health and the well-being of the people we're in relationship with, that when it calls for it, we're ready to roll up our sleeves and go to work on how we relate to each other.
Thank you, John. This is open for Q&A. We've got a question in the queue already, but ask your questions. Use the Q&A feature or the chat feature, either one. John, as you were talking about the impact of distressing events on relationships, I couldn't help but think, for somebody who's going through a betrayal right now and just learning about it, or is trying to work through it, along with the whole world being in crisis, essentially, it's sort of a double whammy of distressing events. And is that common with betrayal? Is there often a double whammy? Like maybe somebody's also having struggles at work, or you said that people tend to focus just on the discovery and the issue at hand, so to speak. But do you often see sort of these underlying issues that are going to have to be dealt with, or that are secondary but are huge?
Yeah, and it's usually in every situation, I see it as kind of a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is you guys just became acutely aware of a lot of crap and a lot of disrepair and a lot of betrayal in your relationship. The good news is generally, when couples get to the point where they want to come and work on things, a lot has gotten out on the table. That's why they're feeling overwhelmed and know they can't do it themselves. So the good news is we now have a lot of the issues on the table, and the question becomes for the people in the relationship: are you going to allow the issues to stay on the table, or are you going to try to patch this up and pack it up as quick as possible so that we can get to um, feeling better rather than doing better? And granted, like I'm in the same boat. If you give me a choice initially between feeling better now and doing better long term, most of the time I'm going to choose, well, I want to feel better right now. Um, and it usually takes me a couple rounds of, well, I was feeling better for a week or two, but this is still awful. It takes me a couple rounds of that to come back to, okay, maybe I need to choose doing better, not just feeling better right now, and let's see where that gets me. But yeah, there's often that compounded. Many of the issues become we're acutely aware of, and the problem is we can't address all of them at the same time. We do have to prioritize. Like when there's a looming disclosure, or somebody's got to go to treatment because they're out of control. We do have to, I always think about it in terms of we've got to whack the gator closest to the boat first. But just because we're focused on this one that's about to climb up in the boat doesn't mean that we take our eye off of where the other ones are at too, because sometimes the issue that seemed most pressing here, it can be consumed by another issue that's even more pressing. And that's where, my heart goes out to the couples that I work with in betrayal recovery, when something like the loss of a job, which I've seen with couples that I'm working with now, the loss of income becomes the bigger crisis than you betrayed me. And there was one couple I'm working with where they both said to me, we understand that this needs to be the focus right now, but we both feel like our hands are kind of tied on this and it doesn't feel fair. And I said, it's not fair. You were just on the cusp of being able to start to address this, and now you have to worry about, can we put food on the table from week to week? But I assured them we aren't going to forget that there's this underlying thing here. We'll work to get stable in this right now, but we're not going to forget that there is something underlying, and that's a real skill set in any relationship. Brene Brown refers to it as this being able to circle back. Circling back is not the same as I'm holding this over your head. It's, this is unresolved for me still. Can we go back? Can we help each other out here?
So, okay, let's get into our Q&A here. First question is, my spouse and I have been separated now for 10 months. I have tried to self-disclose several times. It was more like staggered disclosure. This was very harmful to my wife. I've been ready for disclosure for a while now, but she doesn't want to do a therapeutic disclosure over Zoom. Really, she doesn't want any therapist there at all. I told her I can't do it alone. Any thoughts on how to move forward? And just, they've been separated for 10 months, but it doesn't say if that's therapeutic separation or not.
Okay. My first response here is, if you know that you can't do it alone, please stay true to that. I would not recommend in any situation doing attempting an unsupported full therapeutic disclosure, because it will not end up therapeutic. I can almost guarantee that. The other thing I think to think about here is first, disclosures over Zoom. I know I have colleagues that are doing them. I've opted to not, because I think that the main experience I want my clients to have in disclosure, whether they're the addict or the spouse or I'm the marriage therapist, is I want them to feel very closely held through a really vulnerable process. And it can take time to build enough of a rapport and a relationship with your therapist to feel like your therapist can hold you closely in that. There's also, I think, some safety concerns with doing it over Zoom. So as far as that goes, I have a backlog. Over the next couple months, I will be doing more disclosures close together than I've ever done before, because I have a backlog of people who've been ready for disclosure. We had a date on the calendar and then all of this hit. And for safety issues and for being able to get space, we delayed it until there were some more options afterward. And I don't think that's unwise. So some other things to think about, and this, I just did one of these disclosures on Friday, and My client is the addict, and he remarked to me, he said, my wife shared with me afterward how humiliating it felt for her to sit in a room with another woman and wonder, is that woman sizing me up for defects? And that other woman in the room was her therapist. It's an incredibly vulnerable place to be, to have your partner tell you about all the ways that they've been unfaithful. And I don't know of a partner alive on the planet who, at least initially or at some point, didn't say, this has got to do with me. There's something wrong with me. That's why he or she did this. So it's an incredibly vulnerable place for someone to be. And there's a lot of relationship that has to build there. I think if you can be clear on what your boundary is, what your need is, I need this to be supported, and maybe even extended to, I want you to be supported because I know this is going to be rough. And if it takes you some time to find somebody that you feel comfortable with and you feel safe with, I'm willing to wait for that. I want you to have the very best chance possible at being supported. I think also looking at issues around your own accountability and your own defensiveness. Again, I have yet to be in a disclosure where there's not some point, even though we have a written document that my addicted clients are reading, where at some point I have to turn to them and say, I think you minimized that a bit. Can you get more honest? When left to our own devices, I think we're prone to self-protect rather than other protect. So I think this is one of those areas, I think some more honest conversations about what you need and why you need it, and also hearing your spouse out and maybe recognizing that the options you're seeing now that are either we do a full therapeutic disclosure right now because I'm ready, or we never do it and we do it on our own, those may not be the only two options. It may take some more talking through and really understanding what some of the concerns are for your spouse, to be able to figure out what a feasible way forward is.
Yeah. Jon, you're not the only therapist that I've talked to recently who doesn't want to do disclosures over Zoom for exactly the reason you just said. It's such a vulnerable, painful process that both parties and the relationship need, really intense in-person support. And
Yeah.
Zoom is good, but it's not that good. So yeah, and yeah, there are lots of options. This questioner mentions that he's tried to self-disclose several times, and it's come out more like staggered disclosure, very harmful to my wife. Can you talk a little bit about staggered disclosure and why it's painful and how and maybe should he just stop doing staggered disclosure until both parties are on the same page?
There's a couple of reasons why staggered disclosure is so painful. First of all, is because I was talking to my client on Friday about this. I said, today's the day that the Band-Aid's going to get ripped off. His wife wanted to get in, get out. She didn't want to spend a lot of time processing. And generally on disclosure day, I don't spend a lot of time processing. I want to make sure that both parties are there and they are emotionally and physically present enough to where they can actually get the information in a way that'll be useful. But the processing becomes later. What staggered disclosure is like taking that Band-Aid ripping off process and making sure that we get each hair one by one. It prolongs the pain, it prolongs the suffering, and it puts your spouse in a position of what else don't I know? And I think that's really damaging. The other thing that it does, one of the reasons why I see staggered disclosure happen for addicted folks is, number one, we're prone early in recovery to try to give the level of information that we can get away with, the least amount of information possible. We're not committed to honesty yet. We're still committed a lot to self-protection. And what that says to a partner when you're doing self-disclosure is, I'm still willing to deceive you to benefit myself. And that's incredibly damaging too. I think for a lot of the addicted folks I work with, when they get down to it in their sober mind, that they know that's a betrayal to their relationship and they really don't want to do that. But when they are still really defended and not, honesty is not a way of life for them yet, they'll often choose protecting themselves over their relationship. So that's another reason why it's really damaging. And for most of the men that I work with, they reach a point with this with their spouse, where their spouse is saying, do we really need to do this in a supported way? And the thing I have him think about is, knowing the information that you need to give your spouse, what do you think is the best case scenario? That you two sit down one Saturday morning and try to hammer it out and then not know what to do? Or you have other people there who you're connected to and are not only invested in each of you, but are interested in helping your relationship to heal if that's possible. So, and for a lot of the addicts that I work with, when we look at what's that best case scenario, I'll see them as they understand what is going to do the least amount of harm in this harmful process. They get very committed to not doing staggered disclosure anymore, and they get very good at a boundary that is addressed in my disclosure, and I am committed to being honest and upfront with you. When we get to that second afterward, I'm committed to continue to you about this if this is something that you need. But having that boundary there is I think it helps both parties to have that boundary there, not just the spouse being protected from that, but the addict protecting themselves in their relationship from unintended messages about how they feel about the relationship and how they feel about their partner.
Thank you. Next one here, John. I am a sex addict. I've been working on my recovery for 6 months, and I've been sexually sober for 6 months. Congratulations. I have 2 areas I would like your thoughts on. First, I keep asking my wife to open up to me about her feelings and thoughts, and she has a few times, but I have kept making it about me and my feelings. I know this is not the time to express this. I want to understand and acknowledge her. I keep making things about me instead of acknowledging her feelings. What ways can I acknowledge her feelings and not make it about me? Secondly, let's hold on to this second half because it's a totally different topic. So let's just take what we covered so far.
Yeah. What I see most often when it comes to tell me what's going on and then I make it about me, it comes down to 2 things for me. First is maybe a lack of skill. You may not really know how to empathetically listen. Listening, I think, requires a lot less words from you and a lot more understanding. Things like eye contact, things like body language, things like expressing, I'm so sorry. When I see someone who falls into that, they make it about me, it means that they are staying cognitively defended, meaning they're using their outer cortex to prevent themselves from experiencing some deeper emotion. When your spouse is sitting across from you and saying, I never thought that you would be the one to betray me. You were the person I trusted most. That hits you in the gut. And when you start explaining or making it about you, what you're doing is taking yourself out of your body and you're intellectualizing it. It's a form of defense. I think Dr. Rob talks about defenses in Sex Addiction 101 and even goes through some normal ways to defend. So that might be a place to start, is looking at your defensive and your denial patterns, because that's what's playing out here. The other thing is something like a 12-step or group therapy. That's really good training for empathetic listening. I'll tell you, early in my recovery, the hardest thing to do was to show up at meetings and not open my mouth after somebody shared. And naively, I thought, well, I know what to do about that. I can help you with that. And I came to realize that a lot of that tendency to raise my hand and try to offer help was about my own discomfort with the pain that was being expressed. And a really important lesson for me to learn in recovery is that distress and discomfort will never kill me. But I was living my life as if they would. I was willing to put everything on the line to avoid that. So dive into your 12-step work, your smart recovery work, your group work, and really get some feedback and some help on how to sit with another person in their pain and discomfort and not try to rescue them. That's what the making it about you is trying to change the feeling of the room, bring it to something that you feel like you can control more. The truth is you can't control the impact on her or her pain. And the sooner you can feel that in your body, the sooner you're able to let it wash over you like a really big wave. Sometimes that can be scary because you're underwater and you don't know which way is up. But the way that I've seen emotions work is they have a rhythm to them, just like the waves. They come in and they can be really intense. They also go out. And part of your task in recovery is, whether it's your emotions or another person's emotions, is to get used to that rhythm and to let that rhythm play out instead of jumping in and trying to mold this into something that you might need it to be.
Yeah, addicts are usually not bad people. We tend to be fairly good people who do bad things.
Yeah.
And we have to kind of close off a part of ourselves to justify our behavior. Now, that's a whole deeper issue about what addiction is and why we get there. But we have this denial about the pain we're causing, and when we open ourselves up to that, it's incredibly hard to take it in because we've been training ourselves, often for years or even decades, to not take that in.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Jon hit it. It's a defense mechanism to make it about you and to not feel her pain. But the fact that you're willing to try and the fact that you're aware that you're doing it, I feel the beginnings of empathy and the beginning of, just taking it in what she's feeling and saying, wow, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I know I caused you to feel that way and I'm really sorry. There are some tricks sometimes to developing empathy. We're not born with empathy. We have to learn it.
It's a skill.
Yeah, women are naturally better in empathy than we are because they're taught how to be empathetic. Men are not taught how to be empathetic. So we have to say things like, what I hear you saying is when I behave this way, it causes you to feel this way. Am I hearing you correctly? And, you have to practice and say, when you say this, I hear you saying this, and she may say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all.
I really appreciate that, Scott, because I think one of the most important questions you can ask in any relationship interaction is, do you feel like I'm understanding you? And if the answer is yes, keep doing what you're doing. If the answer is no, you have to follow that up with, help me out here then. What am I missing? And it strikes me when I started my certified sex addiction therapist training, it was my first certification after getting licensed and finishing graduate school. And I was in classes with these brilliant people who had written all of the books that I'm reading to learn about working with sex addiction. Rob Weiss was one of those. And I remember the amount of annoyance I felt in the first module that I went to, because I thought everybody else in the room felt the way that I did. I'm sitting before some of the world's foremost experts in this, and they are teaching me. And so what I felt in there is, if I do open my mouth, it's going to be to ask a question that helps me to understand more. I'm not going to try to make this look like I can go shoulder to shoulder with them, or that by any means our understandings on par. So the world's foremost expert on the impact of your addiction on your wife is your wife. And when she's willing to talk to you about that, it's kind of that same thing. You have the opportunity to sit before someone who knows more about this than you do. And I like those you call them tricks, Scott. I like that, like asking questions. If you can stay in a place of curiosity and you can feel that, likely eventually she will feel understood. You'll get there. It's as soon as you leave that curiosity and you go to that defended place, or maybe you're trying to put a bow on it, or okay, let's wrap this up because now I'm really activated and I don't know if I can do this anymore. It's okay to take time outs in that. And I'd be really explicit about that. You've given me a lot to think about, and I want to make sure that I'm keeping up with you. Would it be okay if we took a break and I'm going to go and get grounded? I'm going to breathe and I'll come back and I'll be ready to listen some more. But it really is, it's a skill. You're not going to sit down and naturally get this. You have to really focus on some really specific things to be able to hear her pain.
Yeah, and the fact that you're aware of it and working on it, I mean, that's the first step. Awareness with addiction is the first step in recovering from addiction. Yeah. Awareness that you're struggling with the empathy is the first step to developing empathy. So, cool. Okay, the second half of this is, I know I am a mother enmeshed man. and I'm putting boundaries in our relationship, his relationship with his mother. But his mother, feels like I'm disowning her. How can I express to my mother that I am not disowning her, but we had a very unhealthy relationship, and the conversations I had with her should have been conversations only for my wife?
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. I'll give you the long story short answer to that. Again, here I read into that question. You're attempting the right things, but it's this: how do I get her to understand? Long story short, Dr. Adams, my mother on this thing. How do I get my mother to understand? But how do I feel it in my bones that this is an unhealthy relationship? And what I'm doing, what I'm not doing is abandoning you, Mom. What I'm doing is taking a stand for my health and the health of the love that I'm choosing. And once you feel that in your body, the words become irrelevant. What you say and how you say it and whether she understands or not becomes irrelevant, because maybe for the first time in your life, you feel very clear on where you stand in relation to your mother, which is important in any enmeshment relationship, is just first experience yourself as separate emotionally, physically, relationally. Um, I think that, yeah, that first step is not losing that space in your body where you know this, and it's not about making sure she's got the understanding. Dr. Adams will say things like, you're not going to have a conversation, you're going to make a declaration. And it's not a move to become a jerk. It's a move to stay really focused on what you need to stay focused on instead of getting lost in another's emotions and another's need, which is the heart of any enmeshment. So that's the short answer to it. If you can make it to one of the mother enmeshment workshops, it's really transformative in that respect, and I encourage you to check it out.
Yeah, and John does lead those workshops, and you can also get them direct from Ken Adams too, I believe. Um, so it kind of
Yep.
depends on where you are. And I just wanted to add, when I was first coming into recovery, I had an unhealthy mother-son relationship that had impacted me pretty heavily, and I had to set boundaries with my mother, and she was hurt by me setting boundaries. And I had to just stick to my guns and say, I'm sorry that you're hurt. This is not about you. It's about me and my recovery. I need to do this. Please respect it. And she heard that enough that it finally sunk in a little bit, but it took some time. And it was really hard to have my mother be hurt by my boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very glad that I stuck with them, and I have a much better and much healthier relationship with my mother today. As a matter of fact, we have, I think, a really good mother-son relationship now, because we went through this. So stick with it.
Yeah, definitely. Pain. Another thing Dr. Adams will say is there always has to be a betrayal in an enmeshed relationship. And either you choose to betray your mother, not in a mean, vindictive way, but she'll be left feeling betrayed because of what the relationship was before, or you continue to betray your spouse and the love of your choice through your continued acting out. And that's really what the choice boils down to. Can I tolerate the feeling of letting my mom down, in service of becoming a healthy person, and be able to return with love? The goal of leaving a mesh relationship is not to leave someone permanently. It's to be able to return as a full person and to love them as you're capable. But yeah, that there will be disappointment, and there will be hurt, and there will be misunderstanding.
Next question here. My husband and I are listening together. That's great. I had evidence such as recorded conversations and text messages that my husband expressed perfectly and very empathetically to my married friend, and it causes me great pain when my husband does not do the same for me, especially when I know he is capable of being empathetic. My husband gets very defensive and accuses me of shaming him when I bring this pain to his attention. What should I do? And then the follow-up here is, the married friend was a new friend and cheated with my husband, using my kids and me to cover the cheating until I found out 2 months later. should her husband be told? So there's a lot
Boy.
in that.
Yeah, there's a lot here. So let's start with that. It looks like there's evidence that my husband is empathetic and caring. While empathy is a skill, I don't think it translates across all relationships the same. Case in point, so we're having the meltdown at my house this weekend, and truth be told, I lost it on my 10-year-old. Like, I was not proud at all of how I handled it for a minute there. And after we had made a repair and we'd come back together, he has always had this really acute ability to call me out on my crap. And the very way that I lost it was what I was upset with him over. He had done this to a friend, and he'd done it repeatedly. And this friend was really, really hurt. And I was trying to get him to see that this person was hurt. And so as we calmed down, he said to me, Dad, don't you help people for a living? And I said, yeah. He goes through various stages of interest in my job, and we've talked about what that help looks like. And he said, one of the things you told me is that you help people to feel safe so they can talk about problems. And I knew where this was going. And so and he said, you didn't do that for me tonight. And I said, no, I didn't do that for you tonight. And I'm really, really sorry. And he said, why can you do it so well that it's your job for other people, but you can't do it for me? And talk about a dagger in the heart. So on my side of hearing that feedback, what I was realizing is one of the people that I love most in the world, I had let him down, and he knew it, and he could name it. And it wasn't just this like, oh yeah, we all had bad days. Like, he could pinpoint it. You have kindness and you have patience that you give to a lot of other people, and you don't give it to me. And so in that moment, I think, had there not been the blow up that I had before, and I was feeling the urgency to really get it right with this kid, I think I would have been overwhelmed with shame. And I think I would have given him something really defensive and not useful at all. Instead, what I had to learn how to do is I had to keep my defenses down, and I had to take a deep breath. And I had to say to him, I think you're going to become more aware as time goes on that I'm not perfect, and sometimes I'm not even enough. I'm not what you need. And I feel so bad when I let you down that way, because I don't always know what to do about it, and I can't always prevent it. So it went from this conversation about why didn't you do this to something more vulnerable about how we can't always do the very best that we're capable of with the people that we love the most. And I didn't talk to him about this part, but it's this, I think it's a big contradiction that exists in all of us, is we simultaneously want to give the best to the people that we're closest to, and we are also capable of being our worst with them. There's something about that proximity that can keep us motivated to keep the act up. But once there's familiarity, sometimes that motivation to keep the act up isn't there, and the person that we're close to sees all sides of us. So as far as what you can do with this, I don't think there's a magic combination to unlock this for your husband. He's going to have to do some soul searching and some rumbling to figure out, why does that hurt so bad when she points out, you do this empathy thing with this other person that you were unfaithful to me with, and I have evidence of that, but you can't do it for me. Maybe he feels like he is doing it for you. The thing with empathy is it's the efficacy of that skill, I think, isn't very well gauged by the person who's giving it. It's the person who's receiving it. Again, I said that golden question, do you feel like I'm understanding you? That is, if when you're really bad, you feel like I'm understanding.
And you're breaking up there. Can you repeat what you just said, please?
Tell me so I think it's the emotional equivalent of jumping in an icy pool. Can you hear me now, Scott?
Yeah, you're coming back.
Asking that question, do you feel like I'm understanding you? Because more likely than not, you're going to get an answer along the lines of, well, mostly, or some. You're getting an answer that's essentially, no, you're not completely understanding me, and hopefully you also get a follow-up, let me help you out a little more here. So part of that is recognizing that your husband's got some things to figure out about what's activating in him, and that's hard to stand back from that and hope that he's able to figure that out. I think the other thing that can be really helpful here is maybe see if you can recognize in him what shame does to your ability to approach a relationship. If you're familiar with shame and you're familiar with situations like that, I think being able to hold it as the minute we start telling ourselves the story, they're capable and they don't give it to me. On the surface, that may be true, but it may not account for all variables. And so I think for you too, go internal and rumble with that. Why might it be hard for him to bring that skill to this relationship? What might be going on? And notice there, I didn't say what's going on with me that he can't do this, because it's not about what you're doing or what you're not doing. For a lot of the addicts that I work with, you would think that getting vulnerable and connection in a relationship is what they've been hungry for, and it is, but it also scares them to death. So at the same time, we may be moving into, okay, this is feeling better and we can do this. He may be really dysregulated. He may not have the ability to bring that kind of a skill to a relationship that matters as much as this one does. But that, again, your husband got to do some soul searching to figure out exactly what that is. I would say you might ask him to, do you understand what I'm saying when I give you this feedback? You might just check, does he have the basic understanding? And if he does and it's still not emotionally resonating, sometimes it takes some time for that to click, and maybe you you check for that understanding and you let him rumble with it for a little while. You let him figure it out, as long as he's got the fundamental understanding. But those would be my suggestions for where to start there. And then the second part, did you have anything?
Can I jump in for a second, John?
Yeah.
And this is just something that occurred to me as a sex addict, as somebody who's cheated on people. A lot of times what came out of my mouth might have looked and sounded like empathy, but it was really manipulation. So I want to just throw that possibility out there. It might look like empathy. We're very good at faking it to get what we want sometimes. So
it reminds me of a spot on I think it's the Green River through southern Utah. You actually float past this old movie set where they shot a lot of Westerns. And it's the old facade, like they still have the facades up and there's nothing behind. I remember after my first trip seeing that, I went and watched some of these Westerns and I thought, there's no way those are facades. Like this looks like a real Old West building, but you get it from a different angle and you see, and you're bringing up a really good point, Scott. What looks like empathy may be a facade. It might be manipulation. Empathy is one of those things where you can say empathetic words, but if it's not connecting inside, you will not experience it as empathy. So that really good point, Scott.
Okay, so now go second part.
Okay. So should her husband be told, this is such a tricky ball of wax? And from your position as the partner, I would look at, do you feel like you're in a position where you're being forced to keep a secret? And if that's the case, I think, again, the conversation with your spouse and maybe the affair partner and saying, listen, I'm in a really tricky situation here where I have to keep a secret for you guys, and I'm not okay with that. We need to figure out how to get everybody informed here. But I don't know that the best case scenario is that you're the one to do it. I think that, again, that's part of that. It's one of those early recovery asks that I think needs to be attended to first as a precursor to developing some safety. Is this person taking responsibility for their actions, including informing all of the people who could be harmed in this, especially where there's infidelity. That's I would get a good marriage therapist and talk that one through.
Yeah, I always this is a question I've encountered before, and I always go back to what I was told in early recovery. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said right now?
Yep.
Does it need to be said right now by me?
Yeah.
And usually the answers are yes, maybe, and no. So,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, I mean, probably her husband is going to find out
Yeah.
eventually, one way or another. Um, Sooner might be better, maybe, but coming from you, probably not the best place, probably not the most helpful place, and the most empathetic place for you uh,
Yeah.
from you. I mean, it would be hard for me to have empathy talking to, that if I was the betrayed partner talking to the other betrayed partner, I would struggle with empathy there.
Yeah.
And, that's not necessarily a good place to be. Okay. I think we have one more here. This is from the cheater. My wife is frequently hostile, aggressive, and accusatory, and it often becomes difficult to be the man she needs. She won't, I notice that word won't, she won't see how this impacts my ability to offer what she needs.
Yeah. So my feel on that, my take on that is there's a real cycle of shame collapse here. I just learned this last weekend about for partners who have been betrayed, they have shame when they approach the relationship with the person who betrayed them, because there's a piece of them that still wants to be soothed and helped by this person, even with the betrayal, which I think is phenomenal. I think it's remarkable. Not because there's self-deception, but it's so hardwired in us to seek another to feel safe. So she feels shame in approaching. She's also going to feel shame in withdrawing, because that's the heart of what shame is shame is an emotion that comes out of a disconnect in a relationship. And I often see this with the betraying people too, is when there's an internal shame collapse. Like maybe you're comparing your behavior to what your spouse needed from you, and maybe quite honestly what you wanted to be, and you definitely didn't hit the mark. There can be this real shame collapse, and shame is antithetical to any kind of connection. So you Scott had drawn attention to the word won't. To me, that kind of language really indicates there might be a culture going on right now where this is about let's get the blame to land, rather than recognizing we are both incredibly wounded here. And what we want to, the way that I would love for the world to work, but it doesn't, and the research shows this very clearly, this is from Brene Brown, is that trust does not precede vulnerability. So this is where I see a lot of couples in this standoff. Well, if you would do this, then I could do this. If you would move this, then it would make it easier for me to move this. And so it becomes this standoff, like who's going to make the first move. And it gets the process completely, it gets it backwards. In order for there to be trust, we have to lead with vulnerability. And so this is where I see a lot of the betraying folks that I work with really have to learn how to belly up to the bar, that in those really heated conversations and where they feel like they're collapsing in shame, being able to say things like, this is so hard for me to hear right now because I'm coming face to face with how I let you down, and how I let me down, and how I let our kids down. I feel about this big right now. I never dreamed in 1,000 years I would hurt somebody like this, and I'm having a hard time placing that. Like, this is not how I've seen myself and I've experienced myself, but it's true. I know I did these things. How do I square that? Leading with that kind of vulnerability, it's a gigantic risk, but it's the only way to get back to a relationship where there's mutual care and trust, or to get a relationship where there's mutual care and trust. If you want to sit back, and I'll say this to couples all the time, if you guys want to sit back and make sure that the blame lands where it needs to, we could do this until you hate each other so much you can't stand to be in the same room. If we want to recognize that both of you are really collapsed in shame right now, and both of you are hurting right now, and what it's going to take to move past this is some vulnerability for both of you. Start talking about how you are hurting right now. Start talking about what's really difficult for you right now. Again, like Stan Tatkin says, don't work on your partner, work on your relationship. And sometimes this kind of back to those patterns that we get locked in around these distressing events. Sometimes the relationship culture is, I just wish you hadn't brought that stuff to the table. And I hear this from addicts and spouses all the time. I just wish that had never happened. Well, the truth is that it did happen. And we can't go back to when it did. So the big question becomes, what do we do in response? How do I take care of myself? How do I offer the care that I can to you through this? And it comes back to the big question, do we want to get through this together? Or are we trying to make something work that's not going to work? And again, I would go back, hire a really good marriage therapist to help you work through this, because those are really, really difficult things to navigate from that first person seat.
Yeah, and thank you, John, for saying we're both really wounded right now, and we're both feeling shame, and we're both, and you know, your wife is rightfully angry if you cheated on her,
Yeah.
and you know she can't help but be angry. You cheated on her, and it's hard to take that in. It goes back to that question we talked about earlier, the question where we were focused on empathy. It's really hard to take in someone else's pain, especially if it's someone we love and care about, because we don't want them to be hurting.
Yeah.
And you know, I love that you mentioned Brene Brown. You know, trust does not precede vulnerability. It's the other way around. We have to become vulnerable first, and usually it's the cheating partner who has to become vulnerable first, because the betrayed partner is so hurt and traumatized that it's, you know, she can tell you how she's feeling, but she's going to struggle to take in your feelings.
When it comes to that betrayal, her choice was not part of the equation.
Right.
And so, you know, to rebalance the universe, I would say, at least for the first year, if not 18 months, if there's going to be a move to vulnerability, it's going to be the person who did the betraying first. And I'll always say to these folks too, if you want this to be a part of your relationship, you better be willing to bring it to the table first. And so if you want your spouse to be vulnerable with you and not defended and not angry, you've got to bring that to the table first, because there's a big imbalance of power. She didn't have choice in being in the situation that she's in. And you did. So you extend some of that recognition through, I'm probably going to be the one who swallows my pride first, or takes a big risk first, by saying, I want to drop the defensiveness, and I want to tell you how I'm feeling right now. I'm going to get vulnerable with you, knowing that it's fully possible that you could rip my head off, but I'm going to give you the opportunity to not.
And vulnerability and empathy are going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Absolutely.
It is not linear.
Well, and it's not a clean process. It's not like learning how to machine a part and you just have to measure this right and drill this. Like it's more like, I don't know, sculpting something out of sand. There's so much trial and error and so much feedback through the process. It's not something you can learn in isolation and perform perfectly.
So we are out of time. We're actually a little bit over. I want to thank everybody for being here today and for really deep and meaningful questions.
Thank you, everybody.
That made for a good discussion. Thank you, John. And John will be back in 2 weeks. Anything you want to say to take us out?
No, just I look forward to seeing you guys back here, and thanks again for the great questions.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Yeah.